Good evening, everybody. I want to welcome everybody to our webinar. We are excited to have you here. Nebraska cattlemen, Minnesota State cattlemen, and the Kentucky cattlemen are really excited to be part of a joint venture putting on our webinar this evening. Just wanted to do a couple housekeeping things. If you do have questions along the way, we would love to have them. To type in your question, click the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen and type in your answer. We will be watching for your questions and we'll get them over to our moderator and our speakers. I'm going to turn the webinar over to Ryan. Ryan Cox is with the University of Minnesota, and he is going to help us get through our questions and all the information we want to share with you guys tonight.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you. A little later in the evening, so hopefully everybody's done with their work day, got a chance to get some dinner, or maybe joining us while you're having your dinner. Hopefully you're getting a chance to perhaps have some beef. I know I did. I had brisket for dinner. So coming to today, talking about meat processing specific to beef right now in a very exceptional year. 7 months in, and what a ride it's been. And hold on, because there's more coming, I'm sure. We know that processors are backed up beyond what they can handle right now. Personally, I can speak here at the University of Minnesota. We're processing animals simply because processors cannot. The overload is real. We're going to continue to see that with beef, as we know. And so we hear a question at this time of year, very much that we hear an extension a good bit. And so just to let you know a little bit about myself, I'm the extension meat specialist at the University of Minnesota. I've been there since 2008. Help run our meat lab there on campus and primarily work in extension there in animal science. A lot of what I do is working with small to medium-sized meat processors, troubleshooting, etc. Every year I continue to get calls and emails about I'd like to start a processing facility. There's not enough options for me, or I'm just interested in getting into the business. I need to understand the ins and outs of that. After several discussions on the phone or in person, etc., it sounds like a doom and gloom discussion, and when in reality, we're just trying to give you as many warnings ahead of time as possible, making sure that you get it right. And so with that, we have created a small panel here of myself. I'm joined by Laura Field with the Nebraska Department of Agriculture. She's joining us sort of as the regulatory perspective on plants. I know in Minnesota, we work closely with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. They are an invaluable resource and understanding what it takes to get started in the meats business. And so I felt as though it was important for us to have that perspective. I'm glad that Laura's able to join us and give us that perspective. Additionally, we're joined by Preston Carell from Marksbury Farm. But before I do that, I'll turn it over to Laura just briefly to give her a little bit about her background and so you can understand her perspective.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Ryan, for that. Glad to be with you tonight. I hopefully know quite a few of you on the call. My name's Laura Field, and I currently serve as the legislative coordinator for the Nebraska Department of Agriculture. As Ryan said, this topic has been one on the front of lots of people's minds, especially for the last few months, and we have had a lot of discussions at the Nebraska Department of Agriculture about that. So happy to be on tonight, mostly happy to hear questions that might be asked that we can help with and give you the perspective of the department. A little bit about me by way of background. I grew up on a cow-calf operation, seed stock operation on the Gulf Coast of Texas. My husband and I have been in Nebraska for about 8 years, and when I was in college, I was actually on the meat judging team, and so I've said to many people at the department, this conversation brings back a lot of memories for me from traveling all over the country to different packing plants when I was in college. But prior to this role, I actually worked for Nebraska Cattlemen as their state legislative affairs director, and glad to be participating with my friends on the call tonight and look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. I'm glad you made that reference to meat judging. I'm a very proud former meats judging coach. Since we've got Kentucky here, I was a coach for 2 years at Kentucky, so great to hear that as well. In addition, we're joined by Preston Carell from Marksbury Farm, and I'll ask him to do the same, perhaps share with us a little bit about his background and give us his perspective.
Sure, thanks, Ryan. Everybody can hear me?
Yep.
All right, I'm Preston. I'm with Marksbury Farm. We have an abattoir and meat processing facility and wholesale meat company and restaurant and retail meat company here in central Kentucky, about 30 miles south of Lexington. I come out of it. I come out of a background of farming, so I was doing direct marketing, grass-fed beef, pastured poultry, and that sort of thing. Since 2004, in 2010, I partnered with a few local guys, and we built Marksberry, which is our processing facility. It's about 12,000 square feet, multi-species. We did all beef, pork, and chicken, lamb, goat, alpaca from time to time. If people brought it in, we took care of it. We are moving away from chicken this year in 2020, partially because of the demand that we're talking about. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for being there. Hopefully we don't have any questions right up front. Otherwise, I've not done a very good job of introducing everyone, but I want to move right into it and talk about processing and processing facilities. First question right off the bat, everybody says and comes to me with is, I've got a market, I've got cattle, I'm ready, let's go, I need a processor, I need them to take them now. After, again, further consultation, even if we get these plants off the ground for a year or two, I go back to saying, is there a true market for your product, number one, and number two, is there a ready supply of it year round? And so that's kind of the supply and demand side of that. And so I'll open that up first, and specific to Marksberry Farm, perhaps you can give us some example of identifying, is this worth getting into? Is there enough of a market? When I go to the bank and look for financing, is this going to be a reality?
So is your question, is there enough of a market to justify a new processing facility or to justify a meat business?
The meat business itself specific, because we're talking about going from, the cattle business with this group perhaps, or the livestock business in general, and getting into the meat business specifically, knowing the cost now especially,
Sure.
Understanding what you're getting into as far as, is there a market for your product?
So that's my background. I made that move 15 years ago, and it was a great move for me. What I would ask myself is, how much time can I afford to spend doing it, and can I keep my day job while I'm doing it? Because it will, in 99 cases out of 100, you will fail if you're counting on this new venture to pay your salary, pay for the farm, pay a mortgage, do these things. It's not going to, I don't care what your pro forma says, it's not going to work out that way. But if you can start with a freezer beef for 2 or 10, or if you're a robust marketing person, 20, and find some customers and organize some processing, figure out the logistics, it can be really rewarding. And so if you do that and start slowly, then I would say the top priority is to have excellent accounting. Because when you're doing it at a small scale, it's very easy to kind of lose time in the business. And those things add up when you have to pay somebody to do it. So you want to have very precise accounting on the time you spend doing this, and a realistic expectation of how your economies of scale bring that down on a per piece basis as you grow. But, I have nothing but encouragement for people that want to, sell a beef to neighbors or sell 10 beef to neighbors and keep doing everything else they're doing. I have nothing but caution for people that want to start from scratch and go out and get a big bank loan and get into the meat business. It's possible, and some have made it work that way, but it's the exception, not the rule.
Well, thank you for saying that. It's kind of the perception I think some have, is that we go out and get the loan, build a big facility. And I'm glad you did stress it's sort of getting into that sort of piecemeal, if you will, in certain sectors of processing. Just in my notes here, and perhaps Laura, you can, and I can speak a little bit from my interaction with Minnesota Department of Ag. When somebody's looking for state inspection, they tend to consult with that client for a number of months, simply for this reason. Is this actually going to happen? Are we going to put our time and our resources into working with this plant, and then they may or may not even pull the trigger and get off the ground? And so can you maybe speak a little bit to success rates of people reaching out and wanting to process versus those that actually do end up processing past a year or two?
So we are, I would say that we're maybe unique isn't the right word, but certainly interesting in our landscape of facilities here in Nebraska. We have big packers. We've got a lot of smaller lockers that do USDA are certified to be USDA inspected, and we have a number of custom exempt. Pretty balanced between those smaller size lockers on those that are USDA approved. We don't have a state inspection program in Nebraska. We're not totally unique in this region, neither does Colorado, but most of our surrounding states do have a state program. We had one until 1971, and the program was stopped mostly because of funding, and also as people were sort of moving into the process of, if you're going to go through the rigors to become an inspected facility, why not just go to be a USDA inspected facility to have a bigger market, even with, intrastate versus interstate. And so we have not had a program since 1971. There have been a couple of directives from the legislature to study pilot programs and to look into it, but it certainly has not been something at the department until recently that we've had some questions about what that would mean to get a state program set up and running. I think it's interesting because many people, there's a huge education curve here, because I think many people think, oh, state inspection, that's going to open up a whole new market. It's going to make things a lot different. But in truth, there's still quite a few hurdles. And I think to your point, it's the one thing we hear is getting a facility prepared, getting a HACCP plan in place. We're very fortunate that we work closely with the scientists and extension folks at the University of Nebraska, and they help a lot of those folks, but yet it's still a pretty rigorous process to get that up and going.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Extension is a great resource, obviously, as a representative of that. Hopefully, very early in the process, you are reaching out a lot. And that's something I'll continue to encourage throughout this discussion, is reaching out. I've found that people in the processing business are only looking to help, generally don't see you, especially in the smaller sectors, as a competitor, because there are so few of you now in smaller processing facilities. So definitely, I appreciate you mentioning that. So now we're getting off the ground, thinking about a market, trying to promote. Preston, perhaps you can talk a little bit about your product itself. If you were selling freezer beef at first, up to what you're doing today, was there something that you hung your hat on, so to speak? Was this a grass-fed product? Was it all natural? Was it Kentucky Proud? All of those things.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think something, like you said, something to hang your hat on. I'm not sure it matters that much what it is. I think all of those labels have currency in the marketplace. My particular path is for the monogastrics, for the hogs and the chickens. It was is raised on pasture and all natural. For the beef, it was grass-fed beef. And our program is 100% grass-fed beef. We actually explored. We're particular about things being raised on pasture, but have no issues with grain being fed. But as we explored having two lines, it was a very important lesson for us to realize that for each line of product you have to hold the necessary inventory to support a business. And when we were starting, inventory for us meant something like 15 weeks of sales. That's about the inventory we had to have to get 80% of people 80% of what they wanted. And I made those numbers up, but that's about kind of the way we had it figured. And so that's a huge amount of operating capital. And if we kept grass-fed and grain-fed like we wanted to do, it would have been double that amount of operating capital. So we had to choose our fastest growing, our what we felt like was our best niche, and that was grass-fed. I think that a local program, focusing on local to Kentucky or anywhere else, can have a lot of currency. Today we're doing, we do processing for Beef Solutions, which is actually a Kentucky Cattlemen's program, and really their selling feature is the Kentucky local thing, and it's found a lot of success in the marketplace. So I think it is important to have something. If you go at it with with a completely conventional product and don't have a way to separate yourself in a marketplace, then you're probably relying on things like marketing budget and price to separate your product, and you're going to lose those battles. You're not going to win on marketing budget or price.
Yeah, it really breaks my heart to hear people say they're going to go up against Tyson and just.
They may, and you can win in some things going up against Tyson, but you better choose the things you can win at.
Right. And so that's kind of gets back to the smaller processor marketing, niching, and that gets to marketing. Can you maybe talk a little bit about getting into calling your product grass-fed? What does that mean when you're trying to market it, when you're labeling it? And maybe, Laura, you could also touch on just the concepts of labeling with grass-fed as well.
Well, I have to confess, I'm maybe behind the times on the federal guidelines. They have evolved in the past 10 years. For us, grass-fed means 100% grass-fed, no grain. We use the standards of American Grass-Fed Association, which has certain allowable supplements. And so in times of doubt, we lean on organizations like that do third-party audits to help us split hairs. You know, we're not in the business of splitting hairs. We want something that is in broad strokes a grass-fed product with no corn or wheat or anything in it. But there are times when supplements are appropriate and necessary, and so we rely on like American Grass-Fed Association to do that. As far as labeling, having a third-party audit like that, if you're non-GMO, you can get third-party audits for that. If you're animal welfare approved, there's a number of things that you can choose to hang your hat on and get third-party certification for that. That is more important as you grow. When it was me on the farm, and even at Marksbury just starting out, we relied on relationships to do all that stuff and didn't find third-party audits important at all. In fact, our label claims weren't that important because we had enough conversations with people to explain what it is. It's getting past that kind of mom and pop level where things like label claims and third-party audits are really important. Yeah, I'll let it go there.
Sure, yeah, and again, putting stressors on setting yourself aside. So thinking about all the things we're going to do to jump into processing regulatory-wise, and then marketing, there are more considerations on top of that. And so very important to keep in mind, just getting through and being able to process, you've still got to market the thing. That's kind of the point I was trying to drive home. Laura, maybe did you have any other further comments? I know that we also talked a bit about organic and getting certified organic, back and forth on its value. Do we see any added value in Nebraska or Kentucky with any particular claim? Would that be organic, grass-fed, natural, et cetera?
Our facility is certified organic, which is to say not everything that goes through it is certified organic, but we are capable of processing certified organic livestock and putting that label on that stuff. None of our brand is certified organic. We have not. I think there's value in the brand. I think with meat products, it's debatable if the value is worth the increased cost structure, because more than any other claim, it adds a lot of cost to the production. The organic feed can be very tough to come by, and supply chains get really circuitous sometimes with organic things unless you're lucky and have a lot of organic production nearby.
Sure, absolutely.
But I'm sorry, Laura, I would echo your point about having the market in place ahead of time. That is, if somebody, that's just a very important thing. When we were getting started, we were trying to build our facility, and quick anecdote, we went to visit him because he had a facility, and he said, all right, so where's your contract? When do you have to be open? We said, when are you going to be open? So we're going to be open in June. He said, oh man, what's your contract? Who's it with? I said, well, I don't have a contract. He said, well, you don't need to be open in June. You don't need to be open at all. And we disregarded him, but it was to our peril. It was not a good, we didn't realize how important it was to have locked in supply.
Very good point. I appreciate that anecdote. Just having somewhere for the product to go and for it to come from. Go ahead, Laura. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I apologize for interrupting too. We track some of the information as far as if a operation is registered with us, if they have a retail license or something. And so I don't probably have the best information. I will say that I certainly think we have seen people become more creative to try to meet some of those niche markets. I think we're super fortunate. We certainly take a lot of pride in the beef we produce here in Nebraska. Our ranchers do a phenomenal job. And so I think we have seen a lot of kind of box beef online companies come online that have some different claims. And certainly a lot of those are young entrepreneurs that have really researched the market to see what would sell. And I think that is a pretty cool story in itself. But I also think we are fortunate that there's a pretty broad mix of availability of different options if you're looking for one of those niche markets. And certainly in the last couple of months, it's just a matter of, can we find someone to process for us? And, our neighbors are wanting to buy stuff, and I want to get a steer moved through a locker. So I feel like there's probably some more of that coming online, but we've got a pretty good balance, I would say, of different options for people if they're looking for something special.
Sure. Okay, so getting and moving a little bit forward and thinking about now if we've got a market, something that we deal with a lot in Minnesota, and I don't know if you deal with this, especially in northern Minnesota, but seasonality and the seasonality of staying in business. A lot of our processors are processing cattle and pigs, but when they can't, they find that if we're trained to cut, then we're trained to cut, and they do a lot with deer, et cetera, to diversify the operation. So number one, maybe Preston, you can talk about, and obviously within your own operation, it'll be unique, but supply and the seasonality of supply of maybe the different species or the different things that people are looking for was kind of what I was getting at. And then sort of how you stem the gap, if you will.
Sure. So in our, I'm wearing two hats pretty clearly, and I want to try to be clear which one I'm wearing when I'm talking about different subjects. So right now, as the processor, when we started, we were heavily dependent on the vicissitudes of seasonality. It was a serious thing. We started with bankruptcy from January to June, and then slowly climbed our way out and had a pretty good fourth quarter. Third and fourth quarter is always pretty good. And you felt like you got there, and then you realize that January through June comes every single year, and it doesn't go away. We've managed to kind of claw out of that cycle for the most part. Our better months are still backloaded like they used to be, but we found more weekly commitments, customers that are bringing something every week. And that is the reality of the processing business. I think it's partially because, shelf life on meat, a weekly delivery is about appropriate. And if you're in the processing world, your life is going to be dominated by weekly schedules. It happens every week. Payroll is going to happen every week. Everything happens every week on the expense side. You need to find revenue that's that steady in order to justify this big infrastructure thing that you've put in. On the marketing side, seasonality is not necessarily a big deal when you're very, very small, because you can kind of manage live inventory up to about 20 or 30 head. If you're organized, if you get your processing booked way in advance, if you can trust your processor to hold that spot for you, and you can sell it when the time's good. When you're trying to get past, when you get over maybe 50 head a year, maybe 100 head a year, something like that, then seasonality becomes something that is a real thorn in your side, because you're at the scale where you probably need to be processing every week, but it doesn't always make sense from an inventory perspective, from a sales perspective. And then you have a lot of frozen products, and operating capital comes into it again, and all of those things. So I would say there's a pretty clear difference in scale. And I think it's obvious. I think everybody knows kind of who they are. Am I a freezer beef company that is growing stuff for my customers and can process it to order kind of just in time? Or am I trying to be a meat company that has what retail, restaurant, food service, institutional customers need on a regular basis? And the needs of those two businesses are completely different. The second is less affected by seasonality as far as the way that your schedule works, but it probably still affects cash flow similarly.
Good, and I'm glad you kind of brought that up as well. Leading into, if somebody's going to be the one that sticks their neck out, build a facility, process, they're going to get approached a lot by people that want to use them. Commonly, a great place that our small and medium-sized processor here in Minnesota plays is as a co-packer. And so I'm curious to kind of think, to discuss a little bit about, are you packing for somebody else's brand? If you do, how that came about, that relationship. And then also, Laura, maybe you can touch on this as well, where you don't have a state program, you do have federal inspection, but I'd be curious how co-packing does there in the smaller federal plants.
Would you like to start, Laura?
Yeah. Either way, whichever one wants to go first.
Go ahead, Preston. I'll follow you.
All right, sounds good. So yes, we do co-packing for everybody from the farmer who wants a beef for his own freezer once a year to co-packers that are actually bigger than us. Our branded product in beef is about 30 head a week is the Marks Ferry. and we do co-pack for private brands that are actually big, and that's that's a huge part. It's a very, very it feels really good because we're kind of all on the same team, and we're just trying to scrape away a little bit of market share from those dominant companies, rather than cut each other's ankles trying to go after it. If you're wanting to, as you said, take the big bite and build a plant, I would, if it's a beef plant, I would say even a small one, you better have 10 to 20 head a week lined up, and that's every single week of the year. When we started, we had a customer. One of the things that we used to start our plant was we had a customer that had committed to $150,000 a year in processing. That was our anchor customer. We felt really good about it. The first year we opened, they did $15,000 with us. And that was after making promises of $150,000. It was a really difficult time, and we had to get through that. So I would say if it's not your own brand that has 10 to 20 head a year, or a week, if it's somebody else that's going to supply that for you, if it's a co-packing relationship, get some skin in the game on their part. Let them be an equity partner, or have them loan you the money, and find some way for them to be vested in the success of your venture. Because if it's just not true that if you build it, they will come. You need to kind of have it. Eventually, they will, if you can stay solvent and do a great job for long enough. My experience is that almost every process, well, I will say every single processor I'm aware of would have taken their money and got out within the first 18 months after it opened. They just did not want to be there. And the majority of those that I'm aware of failed, and the ones that didn't have good businesses after 3, 4, 5 years. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's a path to success, but it's it's kind of a lightly trodden path. If the issue is not that you want to build a plant, but you want to be a great partner to a plant, and be really, so you come to me and want to be a co-packer that I'm going to really value. It really only takes one thing. If you have a weekly commitment. If you say, my schedule is dominated by my weekly expenses. If you're going to bring me weekly revenue, we're partners, man. I am gonna really value this relationship. And it only has to be one beef. But if it's one beef every week of the year, then I'm gonna really value our partnership. But if if the first 3 months you cancel 6 times, and I can't count on that weekly revenue, then I'm gonna feel differently about the relationship. That's just the fact. But an important part of our business are the people that bring beef in the fall, but we know that everybody wants to get beef in the fall. The ones that we really value are the ones that are bringing them year round.
That's a good point.
Yeah, and I think directly to the co-packing question, some of these newer companies and groups that have gotten some branded product and box product going out the door have certainly developed relationships with the lockers that they're using. And so I think that's been a pretty cool thing to watch. And I know at the end of our presentation, Gina's going to talk about the Beef in Schools movement here in Nebraska. And I think that's one of the places where, we talked about this at the beginning as far as availability. Oftentimes we have heard from people, it's just a matter of finding a place where they can get that relationship. Certainly with Beef in Schools, it's got to be processed through a federally inspected facility here, since we don't have state inspection. But so some of those programs, I think sometimes it's been a little bit of a challenge, but also, for folks who are working with their custom lockers, or even some of those custom lockers who are bringing in USDA inspected product to then sell out the door for retail. We kind of have an interesting mix of all that. I think we've seen the numbers move around. I was reviewing some research reports that were done by the university in both 2001 and 2011 of just the numbers of plants that were in 2001 that aren't now. So I know we've had some attrition, but we've also had some new operations come online. So that's exciting. And I think to hear the people who run those talk about it, it certainly has been a labor of love in many ways, but they're doing some cool stuff working with those companies that have come online.
Excellent. Okay, glad you mentioned the state and the federal thing. I kind of want to move us forward a little bit, maybe Preston, you can help us as the example, give us maybe a little bit about how you came about it, but mentioning, and we keep using the phrases custom, state inspected, or federally inspected. That's a discussion that is had depending on how you look to distribute the product. And that kind of gets me into, how are we looking to distribute it really? Are we looking for an on-site sales room? Are we working to distribute? Are we looking for wholesalers, working direct with supermarkets, et cetera? And so maybe you can, I don't know, perhaps you started custom, went to state and perhaps federal, and what that takes and where the big jumps were maybe.
Sure. So Kentucky also does not have state inspection.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we opened, so my background, we were processing chickens in our backyard. My wife and I were under the exemption, the federal exemption. Those of you that are in the know on this know that you can, according to the federal exemption, a family can process up to 20,000 birds themselves and sell it. So as long as it goes to the end user, even a restaurant, as long as the person cooks it and doesn't resell it. And so we were operating under that. So I was kind of in the processing business long before we started in processing. What we were running up against is the last year we did that on the farm. Well, in Kentucky, the exemption is only 1,000. So states can reduce the exemption, they cannot enlarge it. So 20,000 is the max. Some states disallow it altogether. Some have further restrictions. In Kentucky, you can do 1,000 chickens. We processed 10,000 chickens in our backyard the last year that we did it. The law's not really, it's a little poorly understood. So we thought, each of our 3 kids were doing 1,000 and I was doing 1,000 and my wife was doing 1,000. And we thought we'd stay out of jail if somebody came and caught us, but we really didn't think that our interpretation would keep us in business if the health department came calling at our door. And so inspection was critical right from the get-go for us. We started a processing facility because we had to have inspection. And so we went USDA because state doesn't exist in our area. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's Talmadge-Aiken is the legislation that allows state inspection. And I think Talmadge-Aiken states actually can process under state inspection and cross state lines with that product. Is that right?
Yeah, so how it's been modified, Laura, maybe you can speak to that.
No, that's true. It's so interesting. I had put together a document last week for us to circulate internally. It is one there, there's a couple of different, you can have a state, an MIP, a meat inspection program at the state level. You can be a designated state to be USDA inspected. And then there are those few states that have the Talmadge-Aiken, where it's been an agreement that's been entered into between those states and FSIS, different cost sharing, different things, but as far as regulation. And then some states that have state inspection programs can also apply for cooperative interstate shipping status, which there's a few states, and Iowa just came online there too, to allow for those products to then be shipped interstate instead of just intrastate. So you're correct.
Before we get too far into it, we have a quick Q&A. There's a question about how many plants have closed in the past 5 years and how many have opened in the past 5 years. I would actually, I suppose, direct that one to Laura, maybe, perhaps, give an idea of what's perhaps happening in Nebraska. I don't know if I'd have those numbers here in Minnesota.
I probably can't tell you in the last 5 years. I know in the reports that we have been looking at here, there were, estimates, and we have to acknowledge too, we don't always know, because if they're not, since we don't have state inspection, if they don't have a retail exempt license to where they can, further process stuff, we may or may not know, since it's still oversight of Nebraska is at the federal level. But I know that we had the estimates from the report back from 2001 were between 100 and 120. Now we're looking at closer to like 75 to 80. As far as new plants, there's 1 or 2 that I know of that have come online, but I don't want to give you misleading information too, but that's certainly something that I can look at closer and get that back to everyone over at NC to get shared out too here in Nebraska, if that's helpful.
Another subpart to that question, and just as an aside, is there a map of all of those locations where those processors are? I can speak to Minnesota. The Minnesota Association of Meat Processors, as well as Minnesota Grown, we do have maps and lists of processors in the state by map. et cetera. I don't know if you might want to speak to Kentucky and Nebraska as well.
Yeah, here in the state, so the Nebraska Association of Meat Processors is also organized. We had some discussion earlier this year about their membership list being shared as far as where those processors were. We don't maintain that list for them since we don't, have oversight there. The FSIS list for those plants that are USDA inspected under the Food Safety Inspection Service, that list is updated. Really, I think it's monthly. It may be more regularly. I tend to go on there oftentimes and search and look for those operations. I know that the Nebraska cattlemen also maintain the list of the federally inspected lockers that are available for the Beef and Skulls program. So for those that are on the federal inspection list, certainly that is a list that's available, and we can get that to folks. But for those who are custom exempt lockers, we probably don't have them all, but the Nebraska Association of Meat Processors would certainly be a place to start.
I suspect the situation is the same in Kentucky, though there may be a list of the custom plants, but I'm not aware of it.
Sure. So just one more kind of point here before I kind of shift gears and get into the actual facilities, et cetera. But something has been done at least 2 to 3 times here in Minnesota, northern Minnesota, is a risk assessment, an assessment of the market. Did you rely, Preston, on any of that type of information when you were getting started? And Laura, is that done, is something that you've done as well or seen done in Nebraska? People evaluating risk, demand, et cetera, in different parts of the state?
Frankly, not really. We felt like, I was in the business. I was already selling a certain number of each of those species. Felt like I had an idea of who my customers were, and felt like I had some commitments from co-packing customers, and that's what launched us. We didn't do a whole lot of. We had a lot of chefs say, "Oh yeah, and we'll buy a lot more from you if you do that." That we have a lot of that stuff, but no, as far as an organized assessment, we didn't do that. And I'll just share this from our own personal experience. If we weren't pretty effective at finding financing and convincing people of our business, we wouldn't have survived. We lost more money in the first 3 years than we spent building the facility. And so by saying that we did not have a risk assessment, obviously that doesn't mean that I'm recommending that approach.
Laura, any thoughts on that or things that might be happening or happened in the past there in Nebraska?
I don't know that I have much insight to add there. I think certainly over the past few months, we've heard a lot of interesting ideas, and people have been exploring options on what can we do to open things up a little bit or make some more opportunities available. So I think there's a lot of creativity being considered right now.
Sure. Absolutely. I agree. We have to be creative right now. It's 2020 and kind of anything's on the table. So I want to shift gears a little bit, talk about getting into processing meat, because that's the piece that is probably the most foreign to the group, might be why you're here. Talked a lot about the product and the demand for it, but now let's get into the nuts and the bolts of the thing. And Preston, again, if you'd be so kind as to kind of give us perhaps a little insight on your story. Not necessarily all the things you had to do, because there's a lot, right? You got to get your contractors, your subcontractors, all your suppliers, et cetera. But where did you start? Where did you start looking for all of the equipment specific that you would need to process meat, which is different and harder to find? And it's, in my experience, difficult to find people that are experienced building facilities of that type.
Sure, no question. And the ones that can build it turnkey for you, you're going to pay for it. You're probably going to pay double or 2.5 times what you could have built it for if you just knew what to do. And hiring local contractors. We incorporated our company in 2008, and our facility was built. We opened in August of 2010. In the intervening time, we traveled the country looking at different plants that were smaller than we wanted to be, were bigger than we wanted to be, but trying to find ones that looked about like who we thought we wanted to be. And that was the single most valuable thing that we did. If I had to do it over again, as far as the expertise side of things, I would have just moved and gotten a job. I would have taken my family and said, "Hey guys, keep working on this. I'm gonna move to Nebraska or Minnesota and work with Ryan in his meat lab for 6 months if he'll have me." And just be upfront that it's only a 6-month thing. I want to do this back home, but I'll work hard and I won't cost you much. Maybe I'll do it for free. But having actually experience of how to do things in the plant, we were able to, a couple of key things that helped us get started. A guy that was helping us with HACCP plans, he had experience in a meat plant, and not a big one, not tons of experience, not great experience, but some experience. And he agreed to a 6-month contract to help us get started. And we were all farmers. We didn't know anything about, we thought we knew which end of the knife to hold, but certainly not how to hold it. And so it was really important to have somebody like that to help us get started. In traveling, that 2 years of traveling that we did, I think that was very effective in getting us the relationships we needed to have with the, with the contractors, with the builders, with the equipment manufacturers. And I think we were able to pull that off. That was a success story, I would say. Like, we did that pretty well, mostly because we traveled and talked to people that were already in the business and took careful notes and then networked from there.
Laura, did you have any thoughts, comments on that particular sort of area? Getting started, are there resources available? I can tell you a number of resources within MDA, but also our state association. I know that Nebraska's is a very strong state association and have worked with some of them as well. Great people there to sort of point you in the right direction, really.
Yeah, we've actually been having those conversations as to if we could wave a magic wand and have access to either the funding or the resources. What would that be? There are a number of resources available through the University of Nebraska Extension, and even from sample forms. I think, to Preston's point, the one thing that we hear people say is getting your facility ready and getting a HACCP plan and SOPs in place are the things that are often people may not be prepared on how to deal with. And so that, and how to process the product, but finding opportunities for people to attend seminars and workshops. The University of Nebraska has worked kind of with 5 states in this region to host some of those opportunities for approved HACCP training seminars, so that people can come learn how to write those plans and work through those. We, I think, are always open to looking for opportunities. I know Ashley's going to talk about it at the end, but there's some federal legislation that's been introduced to put in place grants for some of these facilities to upgrade. And so those are the kinds of things that I think we're always kind of keeping our eyes open to see if we can help get information out to anybody who's interested.
Just quickly looking at the questions, I have 2. I have one I'm going to save for towards the end, but one is setting a price for your product. We have a question from Kentucky. Small operator, starting to sell beef to people I work with, do gain a grain and grass-fed beef. What do I need to look at to set a good price per pound? That gets into operations, thinking about your margins, et cetera. I get that question too a lot. And it is multifaceted. Perhaps you'd like to just go through a little bit of what's considered when you do that.
Yeah, so if you have to be in the business, then you're concerned about what the going rate is. Like if this is your livelihood and you're well enough capitalized to survive, then you have to keep your customer, and you're concerned about what the going rate is and pricing it, where the market will bear. If this is not your livelihood, then your price should be 100% based on your cost of goods and then the expenses, and making a fair margin on top of that. I would probably, a reasonable approach would be to take the wholesale price that you're used to getting, whether you take it to the sale barn or do internet auctions or have a contract, and take that price and get that before adding anything, before adding anything else to it. And then probably add 20% to every other expense that you have to it. So you count the hauling, you count the processing fees, You need to count how long. You need to put a fair value on the inventory that's in your freezer. I don't know if it's 10 cents per pound per month. I mean, you can come up with something that's reasonable based on what your freezer costs you and electricity and things like that. But don't forget that one matters. And then, you need to count on not selling the whole beef unless someone buys the whole beef. And then that's great. Then it's really easy to calculate margin and just go from there. But if you're selling pieces and parts, you need to count all that, and then the time spent on the phone, the time spent doing it. Value that cheap, or your price is going to be ridiculously high on the front end, but value it for something. So you're used to counting that in, and then put a little bit of a margin on it. And you probably won't like how high the price is when you get there, and you can make a decision based on if you get joy out of the business or not. But it's, if you don't have to be in it, I would start with a cost plus model and not look at what things, not look what your competitors are charging.
Okay, so moving a little bit forward now, getting into the plant, we've got a plant. Let's get into being inspected. We talked about, let's say, federal inspection, state equal to, which is equal to federal inspection. Talking about all the programs, the prerequisite programs, some acronyms that people don't understand if you're not in the business, but an unbelievable amount of paperwork to people that don't realize that it's there. I like to ask it this way to processors sometimes: how much as a percentage of your time or your money or your effort would you say goes into prerequisite and HACCP things such as SOPs, SSOPs, GMPs, and your HACCP plan validation, testing, etc.?
Well, the good news is if you grow, it's less all the time as a percentage. The percentage shrinks all the time if your business is able to grow. When you start, you could probably spend 100% and it wouldn't be enough. I mean, there's going to be shortcomings in those programs when you get started, and your USDA inspector is going to let you know what those shortcomings are, and it's going to cost you money to rectify them. It's just part of it. It's part of the ignorance tax that we all pay in any new venture. Processing is not unique in that sense. I'm trying to think today. It would be a small percentage. Now, if there's an issue, if AEIOU has to come in, that's a step beyond frontline inspector. That's if you need a food safety assessment or something like that. Then it's going to still be a lot. You have to really satisfy them, or if there's an issue in the plant, then it can ramp up and be a significant percentage. But in general, operating today for us, it'd be under 10% of our time and energy and expense is spent on just the compliance side. But we also, I guess, to drive that home further, we've decided to do quite a few third-party audits that are GMP, good manufacturing process third-party audits. And every one of those exceeds USDA standards. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist, because the USDA is already there requiring you to do up to this much. So to go beyond that, and so we stress out about our third-party audits for private label, and the USDA is kind of a cakewalk after that.
Definitely, and that's actually a question we just got about SQF, and perhaps you can speak to that. The I don't know, percentage of your clients, your customers that require something like SQF, something beyond HACCP.
Well, we have a few hundred clients, and very few of them require SQF, but the ones that do have the capability of buying quite a lot of product. Right. So even though it's a very small percentage of our clients, it's a much larger percentage of our throughput. It makes you better. It's not, if you feel like you can do it, and you have the I guess administrative margin to do something like that, I don't see much of a downside to taking it on. There's some expenses that are tough to bear initially, but once you've done them, you've done them, and it adds some credibility to your facility, and when you're trying to court a new customer, if it's in food service or institutional or somebody that has a regional or national footprint, and they see SQF, they usually just don't ask any more questions. They know you got it handled.
Absolutely, agreed. And Laura, maybe you can touch on that too there, especially in Nebraska with the large beef plants. SQF certainly being a part of the conversation there. The smaller plants, is that something they're facing as well?
Yeah, I don't know. I have a feeling the answer to that question is yes, but I'm not 100% sure. I know it's been one of the things that we've talked about when it comes to the questions we've been getting about why we don't have a state program, and then just thinking through, you know, the cost share between the state and still having to meet that equal to standard. It's been one of the big points because, you know, standing up a program and in different ways, the time it'll take, the programs we have to meet. And so I'm not sure I have a great answer for you on that as far as what they're facing.
Sure. And no problem there. I mean, there's a number of issues for sure. I want to touch a little bit on the one thing that's a bugaboo in Minnesota. I have a feeling we're dealing with it outside of meat processing, food processing, and all of agriculture, is trained labor. The issue of trained labor, labor retention in processing, in food processing, and specifically in meat processing. I feel like it's a topic that we go through every year at our convention when we meet as processors. It's something that is written about a lot. We know that the conditions in processing facilities are not sitting behind a desk. It can be cold, you can have longer hours, they can be wet. Competitors can pay more for less in some ways. And then there's a regionality as well. So maybe you can talk a bit about that, Preston. Also, what you've seen, Laura, as well in Nebraska. It's, I think, something we're dealing with nationally.
If you're, I think this is size dependent, and this is one of the cases where size kind of forges its own anchor, where a lot of the things we're talking about, as you get bigger, it gets easier. In this case, I would say it's just the opposite. You know, your relationships can bring in a lot of labor when you're smaller. And also, I mean, up until about 2 years ago, if we had guys on the kill floor or the cut room not show up, I just knew what I was doing that day. Like I could personally contribute enough motive force to the floor to make up the difference. And today that's just not true. I mean, I can throw in and help, but it's only a mild bit of help.
Sure.
And so, I mean, our labor force, I think this is important for people to know, our labor force is, I think, a pretty good reflection of our local demographic. You know, we're not dominated by immigrants or Hispanics or any particular ethnic group or gender. I think, you know, we probably skew a little bit more towards male than female, but otherwise our team is a fair representation of the demographics of our local area. Now, our area in central Kentucky is not extremely depressed, but I fancy that labor may be a little cheaper than lots of other areas in the country, and maybe a little more readily available. We have a lot of, you know, farmers. If we can coax a farm boy or girl off the farm, we know we've got a good one in most cases, because they know how to work and they're familiar with long hours. But it is anyone contemplating a big move into processing, I would pay close attention to that one, because it's tough. You got to have a lot. It's a whole suite of strategies. Not one's going to get it done to get people in there to do the work.
I would say that here in Nebraska, we hear the labor issue as one of the top concerns that people have. You know, family businesses where maybe one generation is kind of phasing out, maybe the younger generation doesn't want to take it over. Also, just the reality of finding labor as a state, we face that in agriculture here quite a bit, with the difficulty finding labor, and especially in some of our more rural parts of the state. I will say, though, we've heard some positive stories about it too, that these are good paying jobs. And so even for the smaller plants, when they can find good qualified, especially qualified, if you've got somebody with cutting experience, or, you know, somebody who wants to start working on it and learn from someone else who really has the experience, it's good, solid jobs for folks to get of all ages. I would agree with Preston as far as demographics and men versus women and across all, you know, racial ethnicities. I think we see quite a bit of that. You know, I will say in the larger plants during all of this shutdowns and slowdowns with COVID-19, there were staff from the University of Nebraska Medical Center who went around to a number of the plants and did audits and tried to come up with some best practices. So I think from that perspective, it was something that Nebraska really was passionate about, and certainly we were watching those conversations closely and being involved as a code agency of the state. But from the smaller locker perspectives, I think it's certainly been an issue of finding labor.
Definitely. I think it's something we'll continue to face. Hopefully we can find those great people that are willing to work in that industry. I've got sort of a couple questions here that circle around waste processing and really ancillary markets. And maybe Preston, you can talk about how you handle waste product, hides, offal, etc. Do you have a market for things like pet foods, pet treats, pet toys? We find in Minnesota especially things that can help the business include catering. Additionally, what we call ancillary opportunities, the things that keep us afloat in those inevitable gaps. Have you found a lot of value in those?
So since we started, you have dreams of, because it all works beautifully, right? It's just this big, orchestral symphony of all these things working together. It's beautiful, all the nutrient cycling and financial piping, it all just works. That's somewhat sarcastic. The reality is when we got started, so we started a processing facility, a wholesale meat company, a butcher shop, a restaurant, a pet food manufacturer, a composting facility, and a distribution company, and eventually a collections agency. And so that's 8 different businesses, and we've decided to keep the ones that either are working for us or we feel like we're terminally invested in, and we've got to stick with them. And pet food we let go of. There is a market, it works, but it's also a business. And as much energy as it takes for you to run the processing business or any other business, it's going to take that much to do a great job with pet food. And so we don't do that one anymore. We don't do composting. Now we have a company that picks up all of our offal, picks up our hides. We let go of distribution. We don't self-distribute a single thing. There's myriad opportunities because there's so many verticals that you can chase because there's so many great products with this livestock. And it's really, to me, it's super exciting. I love the idea of, a holistic vision and using all parts of it. And the reality is, in most cases, each part represents a new business model. And there's, for us, there's just limited energy. You only have so much of yourself and your team to go around.
Absolutely. So it came to this, it's inevitable this topic's going to come up. COVID-19 is going to come up as a topic. We've made reference to it before. We've got a couple of questions about COVID-19 and some input as well. Essentially, what's the dollar amount in your states that farmers are losing due to the lack of processing during COVID-19? And then we also have a question on how has COVID affected your labor force as well as business model? And then I'm told Ashley Coles, I think, has some numbers that she perhaps could share with us. I don't know if she can jump on and give us those numbers. There she goes.
Can jump on. So I guess I can talk about overall national specific numbers and then maybe extrapolate that out to Nebraska specific. And I'm not sure if Allison or Becky or folks from the other states can also provide those numbers. If not, I'm sure they can as a follow-up to folks. But Dr. Darrell Peel from Oklahoma State University, in a study commissioned by NCBA, did a study on, through April of this year, what the overall impact was to the entire industry in regards to COVID. And they found that it was about a $15 billion economic injury, right around there. So that was just through April of this year. If we extrapolate that out into, I guess, Nebraska specific numbers, that's about $823 million economic injury to the cattle industry here in Nebraska. So you could break that down to cow-calf is 236 million, the feeder industry is 515 million, and the background industry is about 72 million. So that's where we are here. But if you want to see the overall national numbers, you can definitely check out the NCBA website. Has all of that information and the detailed study that was conducted by Dr. Darrell Peel and some folks through Oklahoma State.
Sure. Thank you for that, Ashley. That's great. Preston, maybe you can speak to that as well. If you were to put a ledger or a column in your ledger that said COVID-19, what does it cost you?
What's this?
What
COVID?
how would we? Oh, what is it? Yeah, what is this thing?
Yeah, I mean, the fact is for the meat processors that didn't have to close, and we're one of them, the net, the gross is definitely positive. We've experienced far more because of COVID-19, the short. You know, on the farming side, it's cost us something, but on the processing side, it's been a good opportunity. On the net side, it's a little fuzzier because there's a lot of increased costs that have come with it. Personal protective equipment, managing staff, having processing issues because you plan for one staffing level and somebody's afraid their grandmother's going to get sick. And I'm not denigrating that motive at all. It's reality, but you know, labor has been an issue during all this. So that, you know, we feel good and important and busy. But I don't know on a net basis what to say in our particular business. Probably positive, but pretty marginally is the reality. And if you happen to already have a processing facility, it's been a help.
Certainly. So we're sort of coming towards the wrap up here. I know we can't go on forever and ever, but I do want to sort of close with our panel here of us three and kind of talk about moving forward resources. I'll start by example and maybe sort of list off some things that I find very helpful when I work with new processors, the chefs that want to start a new processing facility, the farmers that want to start a new processing facility. Number one, you're going to want to reach out to your state, number one, and obviously the federal agency. Get on their radar, understand what you're looking to do, regardless of when that's going to happen. So working with your local agencies is very important. If you have a state association, definitely recommend reaching out to that. Something I haven't mentioned yet is the American Association of Meat Processors, which is a collection of very small up to medium-sized processors throughout the country, very similar to the state associations as well. Excellent resources. Maybe Preston first, you can talk about anyone else somebody getting right into the thing who you'd start with.
I would visit. I'd visit private people. When I started farming, my neighbor is still probably the best farmer I know. I knew him then, but not really well. And I started farming, and I did, with all apologies to people in Extension, I was telling him something that an Extension pamphlet told me to do. And he said, Preston, you throw that away. You listen to people that have a farm to pay for. Yep. You don't listen to people that don't have a farm to pay for. And obviously that's not wholesale advice. You want to listen to the facts that Extension have come up with, but there's no replacement for authentic conversations with people that have been in the trenches and are have to pay for their facility, have to pay their payroll and their equipment and things like that. And I would, the more miles you get away from where you're wanting to build one, the less chance of protectionism in the conversation. We try to be an open book, but I mean, even, if you're wanting to open a plant 15 miles away from us, we're going to think, we're going to wonder. And so there's probably going to be a slight element of protectionism in our conversations with you, even though we wouldn't want there to be. It's just natural. So, I mean, get out there, like take a road trip, go visit private facilities. If somebody from Montana or Nebraska or Minnesota wanted to talk to us, I mean, we're busy right now, but I mean, that's something we love doing. I mean, we'd love to help people, tell them what it's been like and all those sorts of things. And I wouldn't go to one, I wouldn't go to two, I'd go to a dozen.
Yeah, that's great advice. Laura, your thoughts getting started? Somebody looking to get into processing?
Yeah, I hate to say me too. You took the words right out of my mouth. One of the things we've said, we've had some interested parties call us and ask us questions, and we've actually looked at the list of the plants that we know that are in existence to try to match up maybe somebody who's wanting to do what they want to do. So that's been our advice too, is go talk to somebody who knows. We point people often to Nebraska cattlemen and certainly know their staff has expertise and knows people in other states. I think sometimes that's helpful. I know there was recently, for example, a plant that had come online in South Dakota. Ashley knew them, and we were able to say, hey, maybe we could connect them with some of our folks in Nebraska who we know are interested. So and we're certainly happy at the department to be a resource. We, are happy to point them to the appropriate resources at USDA. I will say for me personally, just as I've been bringing myself up to speed and brushing off the dust from many, many years ago of college education on this, I've been participating in a number of webinars and listening sessions, even with the administrators from the different government agencies. And it has been super helpful to just read as much as you can, listen to as many presentations where people are talking about it. Lots of different perspectives are out there for sure, but get yourself, as educated as you want. And there's no stupid questions about this. Boy, there's a lot of information and it can be really overwhelming. So if we can be helpful, we certainly want to help connect people to those resources.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is my time to start turning the program back over, I believe, to Ashley. I want to thank Preston and Laura for a great conversation. I think it gave us an opportunity to scratch the surface, so to speak, give us just the right amount of questions to start asking. So thank you for that. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ashley.
Thanks, Ryan.
So thank you, Preston, Laura, and Ryan. So I guess I want to take a few moments to talk about some federal small processor bills. And I want to caveat this by saying if you have any questions specific to how these bills would potentially impact your state, to reach out to folks at the Minnesota State Cattlemen's Association, Kentucky Cattlemen, or feel free to call Jesse or myself in the Nebraska Cattlemen's office, because these bills will definitely impact different states differently, specifically because like Minnesota has state inspection, but Kentucky and Nebraska don't. So I'm just going to give a high-level overview of what they are. And then if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us afterwards. So I want to start with talking about the Processing Revival and Interstate Meat Inspection Act. It's more commonly called the PRIME Act. And basically what that bill does is it would remove the federal requirements for state to have an inspection program at least equal to that of USDA FSIS for products offered intrastate. So basically it expands custom slaughtering exemptions for marketing meat from animals outside of what you would for custom slaughter exemption, basically meat that is for personal use. The next one is the direct interstate retail exemption for certain transactions, or more commonly called in ag media called the Direct Act. So the Direct Act basically amends current retail exemptions to allow processors, butchers, or other retailers to sell normal quantities of meat. So that would be 300 pounds of beef, 100 pounds of pork, or about 30 pounds of lamb from state inspected meat facilities online to consumers across state lines. So this doesn't necessarily go around some CIS or the cooperative interstate shipment agreements, but allows basically to expand those. And the reason that I guess they're pushing this is because if you're going to sell something online, interstate, there is a tracking mechanism to that. The big caveat for this bill is that it prohibits any meat from actually leaving the country, just to protect some of the trade agreements that we have. The most recent bill, so it was actually introduced last week, is the Requiring Assistance to Meat Processors for Upgrading Plants Act, or called the Ramp Up Act. And what this does is it gives grants up to $100,000 to existing custom exempt facilities, but also facilities that are state inspected. And what this does is it provides them with funds so they can make either plant upgrades or hire technical support to allow them to get a grant of federal inspection. So if you are a current custom exempt plant and you want to become a federally inspected plant, as you've heard throughout this webinar today, there's a fair amount of time and maybe potentially additional costs involved with that. So this helps give those folks a leg up in order to do that. So again, these are all pending bills currently, federal bills, and they do impact all of our states differently. So if you have questions specific to that, call the Minnesota State Cattlemen's Association office and talk to Allison, or the gals over at the Kentucky Cattlemen, or Jesse and myself over at the Nebraska Cattlemen. So Benita, I don't know if you have any additional housekeeping items that you would like to bring up before we wrap up.
Yes, I have one last speaker. I would like to introduce Gina Hudson. She's going to talk about the Nebraska Beef in Schools program.
So I appreciate the opportunity to be on the call tonight and talk a little bit about a very exciting program to me and many producers and communities in Nebraska. Right now, we currently have 80 programs in our schools, whether they do that one day beef on their menu one day a year, if they do it several times during the week. It's just a really exciting program to have our Nebraska beef on the menu for our school kids, and they're excited. You know, some resources to try to get started. If you're looking to get started a program in your area, you need to, you know, of course, visit with the administration, your cooks, school board, and local producers. In my area, I gathered a couple of us producers, and we went and started talking and got kind of what our program did is we just got cash donations. The unique thing about this program, though, is that it is unique to your area. Maybe you have a lot of feedlots that you can work with there, or maybe you get donated cattle too. I mean, or just monetary donations. So it's exciting to make that your own program. So probably the largest obstacle that we face and that you talked a lot about tonight is our federally inspected lockers. We don't have a lot of those, and that's kind of a hurdle that we're dealing with right now. We formed a task force with several different people and entities, and trying to figure out what we can do to try to help this program. So currently at my school, we're at Bringing Davenport. I'm a cow-calf producer that's located in South Central Nebraska, and our cooks, we have 2 locations, and they serve beef up to 3 times a week, whether that's like on a soup bar, salad soup bar, or it's the main meal. So it's very exciting to be a part of this program. Benita, do you want to take questions or?
I don't have any questions for you. Who processes the beef your schools use, and what products are most commonly used in the schools?
Okay, so what we did is we work with a feedlot, and they were already selling retail as well. So they were working with a federally inspected facility. So our cooks, they do a little bit of everything. Of course, ground beef is the most common cut. That was one thing that we really wanted to utilize in our school is the education component for the beef in the schools, is not just serve ground beef. We wanted to do roasts, fajita meat, cube steaks, the hamburger patty. They do a tremendous, great amount of different meal preparation, different meals that kids would normally not probably have. We do get the steaks as well, and then we work with our FFA kids. They serve that at their banquet. So we do a lot of different things on that too. We call the processor and get all the cuts of the meat that we want, and then it's delivered to us in a refrigerated trailer. So that works pretty well.
Thank you, Gina. Appreciate
Thank you.
update. I want to thank everybody for coming this evening. Please watch your email for our next webinar in August. If you know somebody that missed this webinar, it was recorded, and we will have it up on our website tomorrow. So thanks everybody for coming. Have a great evening.